We are living in a time where freedom of speech, the right to say what we think and feel, is considered one of the most important human values. But here's a question worth asking. Does that mean being rude is somehow a virtue now? Now, don't get me wrong. I absolutely believe people should have freedom of speech. Everyone should be able to express unpopular opinions without fear of being punished or canceled. But still, there's something to be said about behavior that hides behind so-called moral or ethical principles. Because after all, weren't those ethical rules created to help people live together better, not tear each other down? Let's talk about this through a philosophical lens. There was a Chinese philosopher named Mencius, one of the most important thinkers of Confucianism after Confucius himself. Mencius believed that while moral rules matter, it is equally important for people to develop sensitivity, the ability to sense what kind of behavior fits best in a given situation. And that's huge, because ethics aren't black and white. They depend on context. Think about it, most of us would agree that honesty is a good thing, right? But does that mean you should always be completely honest, no matter what? Let's play out a simple example. Imagine you meet someone, a woman, you find fun and interesting. You work up the courage to ask for her number because, hey, you'd like to see her again. But she looks at you and says, no, sorry, I think you're too ugly for my taste. Ouch, you're stunned. That's not what you expected to hear. So, you call her out and say, wow, that was pretty rude. And she shoots back, at least I'm being honest. Technically, she's right. She is being honest. But does that automatically make her virtuous? Does that kind of brutal honesty actually make the situation better? Probably not. Yes, honesty is a virtue, but in this case, it's not a useful honesty. It's an unnecessary honesty. Her words might be true for her, but they're also hurtful and serve no real purpose. There's a big difference between being truthful and being tactless. She could have easily said something like, no, I'm sorry, I'm not interested, or you're just not my type. Those answers are still honest, but without the extra sting. They make her intentions clear and respect your feelings. That's where Mencius's idea of sensitivity really matters. It's not just about what you say, it's about how you say it. The how can completely change the meaning of the what. And that's something many people overlook when they talk about freedom of speech. They treat saying whatever you want as the highest form of truth, even when it's needlessly cruel. But true ethical behavior, the kind that builds rather than breaks, always takes into account the impact of our words. Now, I'm not saying we should never offend anyone. Far from it. There are times when offending people is completely valid and necessary. For example, when a group uses being offended as a weapon to silence others, then pushing back, even if it offends them, can be a form of defending freedom itself. If you deliberately challenge those who use intolerance to shut people up, you're not being rude, you're standing for something meaningful. In that sense, your rudeness becomes a tool for truth. But there's a fine line here, because some people cross into another territory where they hide behind freedom of speech to justify saying hurtful, hateful things. Let's say someone calls a black person the N-word and then says, I'm just exercising my freedom of speech. That's not bravery. That's not honesty. That's just cruelty, dressed up as principle. That's what I call ethical rudeness, using moral language to justify immoral actions. So, the real question becomes, are you being honest? Or are you just being a jerk? According to Mencius, it's the government's responsibility to help people develop that inner sense to sensitivity, to tell what fits a situation and what doesn't. But even beyond that, every individual has a moral duty to practice that discernment. Having moral character doesn't mean you blindly follow ethical rules like a robot. Rules are guidelines, not absolutes. True virtue lies in knowing when to apply them, how to apply them, and why you're applying them. Because sometimes, being technically honest isn't moral at all. And sometimes, breaking the rule is the right thing to do. Let's take some tricky questions. Is honesty always moral? Can you steal if you're starving? Can freedom of speech ever be abused? Is censorship ever justified? Now, I personally disagree with most forms of censorship we see today. But even I'll admit some degree of censorship can make sense. For instance, should we let children watch certain violent movies? Should we allow unrestricted access to explicit adult content for teenagers? Most people would say no. And that's a form of censorship too, but one that's motivated by care, not control. There is a difference between censoring out of moral protection and punishing someone for merely expressing an opinion, even if that opinion comes across as rude. That's where nuance comes in, something that's often missing in today's online culture. People are quick to label every offensive statement as hate speech, or, on the other end, every criticism as snowflake behavior. But the truth lies somewhere in between. I'd say ethical rudeness, when people intentionally hurt others under the excuse of just being honest, should be avoided. But at the same time, people should never be censored or punished for having opinions, even harsh ones. Because once you start punishing people for saying something offensive, you risk silencing the freedom that keeps societies open and self-correcting. So, is rudeness a virtue? It depends entirely on the situation. If you're breaking moral rules just to hurt others and call it freedom, that's not virtue, it's immaturity. But if you break those same rules in a rude or blunt way to push someone toward truth or to stand up for justice, then yes, sometimes that rudeness can actually be moral courage. Think about tough love. Sometimes, people need to hear something harsh not because you want to hurt them, but because they need that wake-up call for their own growth. In that sense, being rude isn't always bad. Sometimes, it's exactly what helps people become better. Let's dive a little deeper into this whole idea of when honesty or even rudeness becomes a virtue. You see, society loves to talk about speaking your truth. We're constantly told to be authentic, to say what's on your mind, and not care what people think. And yeah, there's a certain strength in that. But there's a difference between being authentic and being inconsiderate. Just because something is true doesn't mean it needs to be said, or at least not said in a brutal way. Mencius would probably say that wisdom lies not only in knowing what's true, but in knowing how and when to express that truth. Because the goal of speech, at least in a moral society, isn't to score points or humiliate people, but to help others, to connect, and to make things clearer. Unfortunately, we live in a world where bluntness is often mistaken for bravery. People think that the harsher they are, the more real they're being. But let's be honest, sometimes that's not bravery. Sometimes, it's just ego in disguise. We've all seen it online, right? Someone posts a strong opinion, and when they get called out for being unnecessarily mean, they respond with, "Hey, I'm just being honest." But that defense doesn't hold up if your words do nothing but harm. Honesty, when detached from empathy, becomes cruelty. And empathy, when detached from honesty, becomes hypocrisy. The challenge is to find the balance between those two, to speak truthfully, but also wisely. Let me give you another example. Imagine you're a teacher, and one of your students turns in a project that's terrible. The colors don't match, the writing's sloppy, the whole thing looks like it was thrown together at the last minute. You could tell the student, "Wow, this is garbage." That's the honest truth, right? But it's also harsh, unhelpful, and demotivating. Now, you could also lie and say, "This is great." But that's dishonest and does the student no favors either. The virtuous middle ground would be something like, "I can tell you, put in some effort, but there's room for improvement here. Let's look at how you can make it better." That response still holds the truth. It acknowledges the work isn't great, but it delivers the truth in a way that helps, not hurts. That's what Mencius meant when he said that moral rules should serve human relationships. Ethics are not meant to be weapons. They're meant to be bridges. So, let's tie this back to freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is one of humanity's greatest achievements. It allows us to challenge authority, expose corruption, and share new ideas. But it's also one of the easiest freedoms to abuse, because with freedom comes power, and with power comes responsibility. The moment we stop using speech as a way to build understanding and start using it just to attack or shock people, we've crossed a line. Now, this doesn't mean we should all start walking on eggshells. If we're too afraid to offend, we'll never speak the truth. But there's a difference between offending someone in pursuit of truth and offending someone just because you can. For instance, criticizing a political ideology or a religious institution can offend people, but if your goal is to start a genuine discussion or highlight injustice, that's a constructive offense. But if you're mocking someone's beliefs just to feel superior, that's destructive offense. So the motive matters. The intention behind your words defines their ethical weight. Let's look at another tough example, the use of slurs or hate speech. Some people argue that banning them is a violation of free speech. But when you think about it, the point of using a racial slur isn't to share an idea, it's to degrade, to dehumanize. It's not expression, it's aggression. That SYID call it ethical rudeness speech that pretends to be about honesty or freedom, but is actually just about hurting others. You see, freedom of speech should protect your right to express your thoughts, not your right to disrespect someone's dignity. This is where a lot of people get confused. They think that because speech is free, it's also consequence-free. But that's not how morality works. You can say what you want, but you also have to own the moral consequences of what you say. Even Mencius talked about this. He said that rules alone can't make people moral. You can have laws that allow speech, but laws can't teach you how to use that speech wisely. That's something you have to learn through reflection, experience, and empathy. And this goes beyond individual conversations, it applies to society as a whole. For example, think about how social media works today. Platforms like Twitter, X, or Reddit have turned into arenas of constant outrage. People throw around insults and half-truths, then justify it all with, "I'm just speaking my mind." But what we've actually created is an environment where performative rudeness is rewarded. The louder, meaner, or more shocking you are, the more attention you get. In that kind of system, decency feels boring. Nuance gets drowned out. It's no wonder that so many discussions online quickly spiral into hostility. The moral layer, the awareness of what's appropriate in each context, is gone. Everyone's shouting, but nobody's listening, and that's exactly the kind of imbalance Mencius warned against thousands of years ago. Freedom of speech without moral restraint leads to chaos. Moral restraint without freedom of speech leads to tyranny. We need both. We need the freedom to challenge authority and speak our minds, but also the wisdom to know how to do that in a way that makes society stronger, not more divided. That's why I believe sensitivity, the ability to gauge when and how to express a thought, isn't weakness. It's strength. It's what separates a thoughtful speaker from a reckless one. Because let's face it, anyone can shout, anyone can insult. That doesn't take courage or intelligence. But choosing your words carefully, balancing truth with kindness, that's hard. It's the kind of skill that takes awareness, humility, and a genuine desire to connect with others. And when you think about it, that's the whole point of speech in the first place, to connect. So next time someone says, "I'm just being honest," ask yourself, are they being honest? Or are they hiding behind honesty to justify cruelty? Because that distinction matters more than most people realize. Let's take this conversation to its final layer, the gray space where honesty, rudeness, and morality overlap. We've established that honesty isn't automatically good, and rudeness isn't automatically bad. It's the context and intention that define them. But this idea opens the door to some tricky questions. For example, is it ever okay to lie for someone's sake? Imagine a friend who's gravely ill, asking you if they're going to be okay. The truth might be that their chances aren't great, but would blurting that out be the ethical thing to do? Or would it be kinder, maybe even more moral, to give them comfort, even if it means bending the truth? See, that's where moral absolutism fails. If you treat every rule, even something like always tell the truth, as unbreakable, you ignore the human side of ethics. Mencius believed that moral rules should serve humanity, not control it. Rules are tools, not chains. They guide us, but they shouldn't replace our own judgment. In his philosophy, true virtue isn't about memorizing commandments. It's about developing a deep moral intuition, an inner compass that tells you what fits the moment. Because every situation is different, and a one-size-fits-all moral code just doesn't work in the real world. That's the difference between being ethical and being self-righteous. People follow the rules to the letter, even when doing so hurts others. Ethical people, on the other hand, understand the spirit of those rules and act in ways that uphold that spirit. Take freedom of speech, for example. The spirit behind that freedom is to encourage open dialogue, truth-seeking, and accountability. But when people use that same freedom to spread hate or misinformation, they're betraying the principle they claim to defend. So when we ask, can freedom of speech be abused? The answer is absolutely yes. That's why Mencius emphasized moral education. He believed it was the role of both individuals and governments to nurture citizens who could distinguish between using freedom and abusing it. That might sound idealistic, but think about it. If people don't learn how to use their freedom responsibly, that freedom eventually collapses under its own chaos. Now, let's touch on another tough topic, censorship. Personally, I think censorship is a double-edged sword. On one side, you need some level of it. For example, protecting children from explicit content or shielding young audiences from ideas they were not ready to process yet. That's censorship motivated by care, not control. But when censorship is used to punish people for speaking uncomfortable truths or expressing unpopular opinions, it becomes dangerous. It stops being protection and turns into oppression. And that's something we've seen again and again in history. Societies that started censoring to protect eventually ended up silencing dissent altogether. That's why we need balance. We should discourage cruelty and ethical rudeness, but never punish people for speaking. We can educate, debate, challenge, but not suppress. Because suppression doesn't eliminate bad ideas, it just buries them deeper. And buried ideas have a habit of festering until they explode. That's why I think the best solution isn't censorship, it's moral growth. When people learn to speak with both honesty and empathy, there's less need for external control. Society becomes self-regulating not through punishment but through understanding. Now, let's circle back to our main question. Is rudeness ever a virtue? Well, it depends. Sometimes, breaking a moral rule in a rude way can actually be the right thing to do, if the goal is moral. That might sound contradictory, but think about tough love. If a friend is ruining their life with bad decisions, you might need to tell them something harsh like, "You're wasting your potential," or "You're destroying yourself." Those words sting, they might even offend, but they come from a place of care, and sometimes, people need that slap of reality to wake up. In that case, rudeness isn't cruelty, it's clarity. It's like a doctor giving a painful injection. The short-term hurt leads to long-term healing. So maybe the real question isn't, is rudeness a virtue? But what kind of rudeness are we talking about? If it's ethical rudeness, hurting people, and hiding behind moral excuses, then no, it's not virtuous. That kind of behavior is toxic, selfish, and corrosive to trust. But if it's principled rudeness, breaking social politeness to do what's right, or to tell someone a hard truth they need to hear, then yes, that can absolutely be virtuous. History is full of people who were considered rude in their time because they challenged norms, confronted injustice, or spoke truths others didn't want to hear. From prophets to reformers to whistleblowers, many of them offended society. And yet, their rudeness became the spark that moved humanity forward. Sometimes, progress itself is born out of rudeness. So maybe being rude isn't the problem. The real issue is why you being rude and what you hope to achieve by it. Are you tearing down, or are you trying to build up? Are you humiliating, or are you awakening? Are you hiding behind freedom to wound others, or using that freedom to reveal truth? Those questions define the moral quality of your speech. At the end of the day, speech is power, and like any form of power, it can heal or it can harm. The difference lies in intent and awareness. So here's the takeaway. Freedom of speech doesn't absolve you of responsibility. You can say what you want, but you should still care about how it lands. Because freedom without empathy isn't strength, it's chaos. And empathy without freedom isn't virtue, it's fear. If we can hold both the courage to speak honestly and the wisdom to speak kindly, then we might actually reach the balance Mencius was talking about. A world where truth isn't silenced, but also isn't weaponized. So next time you speak your mind, remember this. Being truthful doesn't mean being heartless. And being kind doesn't mean being fake. The real challenge and the real virtue lies in knowing when to be both. Because sometimes, the rudest thing you can do is stay silent when the truth needs to be heard. And sometimes, the kindest thing you can do is hold your tongue when your truth would only cause pain. Virtue lives in that middle ground, the place where freedom and compassion meet. And that's what makes speech not just a right, but a responsibility.